Okay, hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the drawing of or sketching interiors. And before I get into the topic of the subject matter that we're going to be discussing, I should say I'm kind of an expert at this now because yesterday I recorded myself, or at least what I thought was recording, of the image, the subject matter that I was going to be posting today, which is this, a Woodhouse Tanucci Interiors. I drew it and did an excellent job describing it. This is what I came up with for that sketch. But this morning, when I checked to see the recording for myself, it wasn't there. So moving on to Plan B, we are going to focus on today's subject matter, landscape, going from landscape to portrait orientation, a Vladimir Radutny interior space, which you can see here. I still am using some of the same concepts and elements that you saw from the previous image. So you can see some of the similarities here. An expressed beam condition, a column, part of a kitchen island, and a stair. So some of them have similar ideas. The language of their architecture is quite a bit different. We have a double high space in this one. So I think that it's going to be a good challenge here as well as with the stair. So two different kind of stairs coming together at once. So as we look at this image, of course, as always, we want to establish the horizon line, but I also want to point out that unlike other images that we've drawn of single buildings in the landscape where we have the ground plane being very important, in this case, I don't know exactly what this base condition, the ground floor plane, is made of. It could be a resin. It looks almost too monolithic and consistent to be poured concrete. We could see that the concrete that this interior space has filled was originally a cast in place concrete slab with beams beneath. So you can see there's a kind of raw texture quality to those existing elements. But the floor itself is very uh, matte and it doesn't really have much character to it at all. So the image that I had looked at yesterday is a tile floor, so the joints kind of lead you to the point, the horizon line and the vanishing point beyond. So we could see some of that, and I actually started drawing on top of it. You could see some here. We don't see much reflectivity at all. We don't see anything kind of showing up much except maybe a little bit of shadow from the island here and this chair. So it's a very clean base, and it's really drawing your eye to the detail and the more raw quality of what's happening in the ceiling. So in some ways, we're flipping this, where normally the foreground had the texture and the sky was left open and kind of unfinished or undefined. In this case, it's going to be the opposite. So we've talked a lot about that in the previous lectures, is leading your eye into a space by creating a foreground that has, whether it's a pattern of joints or a kind of adding noise and bringing down some of those elements and kind of reflectivity of them. In this case, we're going to leave that to be more matte like the image is showing. And so the first thing, as always, is identifying where that horizon line is. And so the stair gives us clues to where that point, that horizon line and the points are. It's going to be right about at where this tread is. So if I just draw a straight line across the image here, that's going to be the horizon line. And both vanishing points, this is a 2-point perspective, the vanishing points are going to be off the page in both cases. One off to the left and one off to the right. So one of them is slightly closer to the page than the other. I would say the one to the left is probably going to be just off the page. So if I were to connect these lines, I would be right about here. So maybe only an inch or two off of the edge of the image that I had printed. And then the alternative probably about 6 inches off the page. That would be where my other vanishing point is. If I look at this as a composition, the horizon line is just below the midpoint of the image. So when I come to my page, I'm going to do the same, just below halfway. I'm going to draw a very light line. That's my horizon. The interesting thing about the composition of this is this column is located directly in the center of the image. It's almost highlighted as being a focal point here. And some of the very interesting architectural moves here, it looks as if somehow this column has been either cut or more likely clad in some kind of metal material, or maybe it's simply been ground smooth and painted black. And then it loses this kind of cylindrical idea of the where the transition between these happen. It's almost at where our horizon line is, so we don't see the curvature so well as we see it at the base, the cylindrical base, and at the top. It's a little hard to read at the top because there's some of that rawness to the concrete. We don't see the curve to this, and nor do we really see too much gradation between one side to the other. So there's a kind of uniform lighting here. And that's apparent where you could see at the base where there's this black section, you don't really see the difference in lightness and darkness being different from one side to the other. There is a kind of sheen to the center, but as we go up into the raw concrete, we might see a little bit of darkness happening more on the right-hand side. But this is the kind of thing that in order to create this illusion in drawing and sketching, I'm going to add more value to indicate this being more cylindrical. I don't have other clues that will help it be defined as a cylinder. So I'm not seeing a lot of joint lines that would help me to define that. So I'm going to have to do that through value. The floor, again, very monolithic. I see a few joints in the wall paneling beyond and in the built-in storage units along the wall in the back. So if I'm going to start off here, if I bisect my drawing in half, that's going to really define where the center of that column exists. And so again, if I come back to the image, I have a few inches, it's equally spaced from the top of the column, a few inches there, and the same with the base. So this is really laying out to be a very symmetrical image, both top and bottom relative to the column. So I'm just going to come in and draw the column. And then just to give a little bit of that curve to the base of it. And I can even do the same to the top, a little bit, maybe a little bit more of a curve, but then now that I have this laid out, I'll move this a little bit. With that in mind, I want to define some of the key points in the architecture here. So this series of beams that intersect this kind of in a cruciform manner, I want to be able to replicate these angles as closely as possible. So whether it's from on screen or a printout, or if you're on site looking at something to try to replicate that, you can use your pencil. In this case, if I'm looking at the image right here, it's very simple. I just have to kind of identify roughly that angle, try to match that. And the same thing goes for the other beam running from the lower left to the upper right, something like this. So that's the bottom of the beam. And it's actually going to be showing up a little bit. I'm drawing this a little bit darker than I normally would. I'm using a very soft pencil, but that's so that you can see exactly what I'm doing. This is the side of the beam. The base of the beam runs into the shaft of the column. There's a gap between them. I want to make sure that I indicate that. And then beyond, I see the upturn of the beam beyond. Same goes for this side. Always knowing that this is because it's running away from us in our viewpoint. I'm going to have more of that vertical leg here. And then as it gets closer to the vanishing point, this is going to start to collapse. So just keep in mind, this line should be consistent all the way across, as will this one. So if I come back to my image now, I could start to look at these relationships. There's another beam here that's picked up that's being transferred here. This could be considered a girder that isn't primary to the structural grid. And then finally another one at the base of the wall in the back. That's this one. So these are again those construction lines, very, very lightly drawn. So if I can come back and make those modifications without too much work later on. So the next thing I want to do is just look again for places that I can see proportionally relationships. So I would say that this millwork piece, which represents the kind of guardrail beyond, which perhaps is being suspended from the slab above through this threaded rod, I could start to define the top of the millwork relative to the beams that I've already established. And of course, every time I draw these, I'm coming down closer to the horizon line that things become more flat. So in this case, the relationship here, I would say that this is roughly maybe a little bit more towards the right than midway between the edge of the millwork here and the edge of the column. And then that will come back. And then we pick up an edge of the black guardrail for the stair. And so one thing to, all of this concrete is in the foreground, so we have to then start thinking about what it is that we would see beyond without having to draw it. We don't see that stringer beyond, so we have to kind of, again, look at the image, try to match that angle as best that we can, a kind of assumed angle here. And the interesting thing about this stair is that it doesn't behave the same way all the way up. At the base, it looks like there are four risers that look like concrete or something similar in cementitious material. And then it breaks down into a different material entirely. So just think about this as in big picture terms rather than drawing each one of these treads and then switching to the concrete. I would rather plan this as one piece and then come back and then later change the language of the risers and the treads to be the material that you see in the image. But as with everything, trying to maintain those relationships. Always looking back, checking everything, the angle of each of these. One tricky thing is, and the reason I wanted to draw something with stairs, they can be challenging for people that haven't drawn them much in the past. And so if the same rules apply, as a guide, you can just start laying out roughly how those geometries will behave relative to the point that we've established off to the right. And then we have the top of the stringer. And even though there is no visible stringer on the opposite side, I'm going to take that angle and very, very lightly in my construction lines draw one that's parallel to it, like that. And then I'm going to come back and I'm going to actually draw where the edge of that riser would actually be if it existed. This is just a way of organizing this image much better. It's easier to understand if I draw it this way. And so now I'm going to break this down. Now that I've got the basic form of the stair and how many risers, I'm not going to count these. You can, of course, go in, count each one of them, but it's not the point of the exercise. I'm not going to say, oh, there's been 15 steps here, but you only drew 12. No, I'm not really going to be looking for that kind of detail. This is a sketch, not a full-blown drawing, which would take hours. I might want to just focus on these four. These are very evident, these risers. I want to, when you have just a few number of something, then you might want to pay a little bit closer attention to it. So there are my four. And now I just have to connect the imaginary point that is on the horizon line to the right. And those are my four risers and treads that are looking more solid. And then when I come up, these are going to be those kind of cantilevered elements that are coming off the millwork. So as I get beneath the horizon line, I should just start to see a little bit of tread. Every time another step happens, I should see more and more tread. And so then, like the inverse of that, as I go up, the tread becomes more and more thin until eventually I'm really only seeing the underside of the tread as you go above the horizon line. It's very, very subtle, but just remember that stairs are often very difficult to draw, but your eye will notice a problem with them if you start to draw things that don't really make sense relative to the rest of the geometry that you've set up. And then one final thing to have to determine is that handrail. And luckily, this is a private residence. We don't have to worry about all of the 4-inch rule for projecting elements that would potentially fall through here. So it's just a simple bar. Okay. You can add this. I have no idea what this thing is. It might be a light. Is this actually, I was looking at this whole thing earlier and how unusual it is. You know, why did the architect choose to break this at this location or at all? Why is the stair changing material at this specific point? And there's appears to be an exposed light here and a kind of egg-shaped something that could be a light. Why is there a singular platform? So you're moving from a wood or some, I don't even know what this is. It could be concrete. It could be a kind of rolled out acrylic kind of finished material. But anyway, you're moving from one material to a next. And as you go up the stair, it changes 3 times. And lots of unusual moves happening here. And then in the distance, there's what seems to be an opening towards a higher level that we can't make out. But there's a series of different planes here. I can see 2 boxes that appear to be clad in a very dark, maybe metal panel, and then a white painted material, and then again, wood beyond. So all of these things, we want to make sure that we get into this drawing. So the first one, I'm going to just start looking at those relationships. What can I pick up? The first one is this millwork panel seems to be aligned with the base of the stairs. So we're going to draw this. It's pretty simple to understand. Again, making sure that we are consistent with how this is falling off towards the vanishing point on the left. And then from there, we can start to build on top of that, which appears to be this white paneled wall, and then another one, which is here. You'll start to notice things as you look at images like this, things that aren't very apparent until you look at them in great detail. So it looks as if this is actually a glazed panel, a piece of glass that I could see the top joint here aligned with the top of this wall, and then another one here at the base, which is then framed by another dark, either painted or aluminum kind of wall towards the end here on the right. And then as I come across here, then I can see that beam again, it's beyond. And then off in the distance, it looks as though there's a window. And you can see some of that here. Okay, so I've established this. Now the base, you can choose to draw this kind of egg thing or not. It's totally up to you. It's not really critical to the architecture. I'll probably end up drawing it just because it's a very unusual. This whole thing kind of feels like an art piece. So then we start looking again for relationships. And here, I'm seeing that this built-in section is I could see there's a panel here. It might be a little difficult to see in the image that you're looking at. And I could tell that because the way that the light is hitting it. So now that panel is really going to interrupt this corner. I want to show that is coming out ahead of that corner in the side panel. Now, if I come here, I can see I've already determined the edge of this, and it looks like the island is just off to the left of where that relationship is happening. And so again, I'm going to draw, always looking back at the rest of the world that I've already created, and making sure that that angle, which is very subtle, which has a small kick to it, just under my horizon line. And then I could draw this table and the chair. You can choose to draw the chair or not, totally up to you. And then another built-in element that reaches up towards the ceiling. And then the base of that, which is recessed beyond, another kick to it. And as I look at the joints, looks like equal panels that form a kind of storage unit beyond. And then there's exposed joists, something like that. So now we've got quite a bit of what it is that we're going to need to kind of finalize this. Some of the additional details up above. I can see that there's a plant here. Again, you could choose to draw that, a piece of art. You could choose whether or not you want to add that. I'm probably not going to add those elements because I'm not going to do a color drawing. And so if I draw a plant here, it might not read as clearly as that. If you choose to do a color drawing, that's entirely up to you. And then the last thing I want to go into before I finalize this is some of the panelization of this wall. Okay, so in kind of record time, this is really it. This is looking at some of the elements that are coming through here. And so I'm going to actually take this and I'm going to, because I had that kind of false start with this yesterday, I'm going to use ink today exclusively. I'm not going to, yesterday when I did this, now let me just flip back to that image. I had done black, ink with line weights here. So you could see that I have some heavy line weights for those profile edges, and then black colored pencil. So you could see the gradient here. This is, of course, a technique that you can use. Today, I'm going to try to use ink exclusively. And so I'm going to actually try to show and illustrate how this image can come together using tone with ink only. So I'm going to just describe once again, it's been a while since I've done this. Some of the tools that I use here, and you should have some of these from earlier in the semester. I have the razor point, the pilot razor point, as well as the fine liner. These are similar, although the fine liner, I can use the side of it much more to create almost different line weights within the same pen. Whereas the razor point doesn't quite do the same. It doesn't have as wide of a tip. I have this, which is the Papermate flare, also for a heavier line weight. And then, of course, my microns, I can go for, I rarely use the 5. I usually use the 1. But again, those, as you've probably noticed by this point in the semester, the tips don't last as long as you would like them to. So I always have to go back and check to see which ones are doing well. It looks like this one is the winner today. And so that's the one I usually start off with, is the Micron, the one that gives me the smallest line weight, because I can always build up on it later. So I'm going to just start with that foreground column. Which is giving me the absolute thinnest line. And even after I've already looked at the tip, sometimes Micron can be deceiving and not be tip that I would want. Luckily, I bought a 3-pack, so I'm prepared. Okay. So just as I started with the construction lines to begin with, I'm going to go through the same process. I'm going to go from the concrete elements, the column, and the exposed beams to start with. Again, you don't feel that you have to do all this freehand. You can use a straight edge. Some of these longer extent of lines can become challenging freehand, so don't feel like you need to do this all, without a straight edge. If it helps you, please don't hesitate to use that. Sometimes it's easier to actually rotate the paper. I don't know if this is true for everyone, but I find that drawing lines straight, or at least more towards me and away from me, is easier than drawing lines horizontally. I can kind of judge the straightness of a line if it's coming down towards me rather than towards the side. So easier for you to rotate the page, that's fine. I'm going to try to keep it straight, although I can already tell that my lines aren't going to be quite as true as I would like them to be. And remember, if you are doing a freehand drawing and you want to have a consistency there with the line, think about moving your entire arm rather than keeping your wrist in one place and arcing, because that's the way that you're really, if you're drawing a long line and you keep your wrist fixed, you can only go so far and it'll start to arc, and then you pick it up and have to move it again. So it's easier to just move your entire arm rather than just rotating around a fixed point, which is your wrist. Hopefully, as the semester has been going on, you've been finding the tricks that are most convenient for you, and you're building a little bit more confidence. You're going a little bit faster than you had been at the beginning of the semester. So those foreground elements, it's really the what you see at the top, the stair, and this base. Those are probably the most critical pieces that define the architecture here. Now, just remember, if you've drawn those construction lines that go through the column, make sure that you don't go through the column here. That would be really kind of changing the way that the architecture is working. And it would be very noticeable. You might have to start over at that point. There are always some things that you want to be able to maintain. That would be one of them in this image. One of the challenges with drawing modernist buildings is there's a lot of precision to all of this. Sometimes if you're drawing a very classical building, you have flexibility because there are so many places where there's changes of plane, moldings and pediments and all sorts of other kind of details that allow you more flexibility in what it is that you're doing. Kind of, you can hide things a little bit better. But in modernism, there's a simplicity, a minimalism, and the detail is really in how well crafted everything is. So even a building or interior space such as this, it's important to kind of find those construction lines being set up well in advance before you get into it, because a little mistake, a little oversight is apparent. So this is a good example of a proportion in the construction lines that I'm not very happy with. You can see here the relationship between the top of the guardrail and this box that extends out towards the left. In my drawing, it appears to be a bit wider than it is in the photograph. So I'm going to, on the fly here, make an adjustment. And I'm sure that you've come across examples of this in your own drawings where you've done something and then you realize that you might want to change it when you get to the point of drawing things with more final lines. Okay. I apologize for jumping around. Sometimes I see something, I capture it and come back. So I started drawing the base of the stair using those construction lines. Now, the important thing here is to determine the edge of the treads, to try to get them as evenly distributed as possible. And then you can come back to establish the leading edge of each one of those treads using the lines that you've already established. Leading edge is important. Then being able to come back and adding depth. So as I'm above my horizon line, I'm seeing the underside of each of these, and then it flattens out. So I can see the depth of each tread here, and then eventually I can't see it. All I'm seeing is the edge of the nosing, in this case, the edge of the board. And as I come down a little bit, I'm starting then to see just a little bit more and more of each of the treads. So I'm seeing the underside here, and then I'm flattening out. And then again, I'm seeing more and more tread as I get to the base. Okay, and then this platform, again, just going back on some of the construction lines there. Again, I find that the relationship in the photo to what I had drawn, I want to flatten that out just a little bit. Again, this line and that line should be very similar. They're parallel to one another, so I shouldn't see this line being really of a different form. You can actually make it out here. If I just draw this, you can see that it's really parallel to those lines that create the stair. Now this wall panel beyond, as it comes off the top of the first nosing of that last tread. And I want to always go back and check what it is that I've drawn and trying to just get as close as possible. Seeing that my railing is a little bit higher than I would have liked, but that's okay. I'm going to continue with this. I'm just going to keep the image off for the top of the frame here because I seem to be holding it quite often. All right, so then I want to come back, drawing this built-in piece of millwork. And because I made that adjustment here, I'm gonna then strike a line there. The whole thing, I pretty much shifted over to the right. And then there are these framing joists that are exposed. So if you drew this chair, before you get too far ahead of yourself with what's happening at the island, you would want to draw that in because otherwise the chair it'll have lines running through it. And so I'm going to come back and start off with this very thin profile table, which looks like there's actually an ashtray on it, and I'm not going to draw that. One of the few items in this image that is casting a shadow or some kind of definition in the foreground on the ground plane is this chair. And it also appears to be some type of, I don't know, a bench or something. Again, because of where it's located, I don't really want to show that because I don't understand what it is. And so, again, not critical to the space. And sometimes I've just done something else. The relationship of things such as the furniture I've pushed in a little bit because otherwise I realize that I'm running out of paper on one side. I want to make sure that I capture that. I don't want to, if I was true to where that actually is, I might push it off to a little bit more and I wouldn't see much of the table at all. So I pushed it in. That's my own decision to do that. It's up to you if you want to as well, depending on how you've set your view up. Some kind of track lighting up here. And then there's that last beam right up against the wall. Some of the joints here are difficult to see, but I believe that these are equally spaced panels as we make our way back towards the end wall. A lot of different things are coming together here at the top of the image, just underneath this ceiling condition where the beams come together at the column. And so it might be a little bit difficult to make out, especially since this plant appears to be in the way of where a transition is happening. Just based on where I'm seeing light change, I think that there may be an inside corner there. And then the other interesting thing is it looks as though this is lower. So sometimes drawing these kind of things, you have to kind of make judgment calls as you go about what's happening, because not every image is so clear as to what it is that you're seeing in the background. Okay, now I've come back full circle. This is that what I believe to be a glass, kind of like an interior window. And move my entire arm to show this. And one of the tricks that I did in the drawing that I did yesterday, is to create a frame. So often in interiors, unlike in architecture where you're viewing the entirety of a building, all of the images here are bleeding out. So in an interior space, there's not a lot of an end to something. It's you're surrounded by walls and ceiling and floor. It's extending beyond your view range. And so so often, and I did this yesterday, so I'll describe it also today. There are things within this view that are we know are going beyond our field of vision, right? So I sometimes will extend things, maybe like this beam, these both, maybe this side wall, and then create a kind of frame where I capture parts of this. I don't want and again, this is just a trick sometimes to do this is to kind of create the frame and have parts of the image flying by. So as you can see, the frame is not, I've added a little bit of a frame here, and so the beams are actually going beyond the edge of the frame, suggesting that this is a continuation. So a little bit hard. I can't fit the entire image on screen. I did the same at the base. So this kind of built-in unit, I'm going to just say that continues beyond. Then I have a foreground here that there's a kind of end to it. It doesn't just bleed off into space. And a few of the other very, very small items that I can just quickly address in the smallest line weights possible are these joints. And then I also don't want to forget what's happening through that glass. And then something beyond, which is somewhat difficult to see. It looks like there's another room beyond with a window. And then the continuation of the beam. Okay, so this is really the level of detail for the line work. Now, I should have been more prepared. I can still see a lot of my construction lines through this. And if I'm going to do an all ink drawing, I definitely want to erase those so that it doesn't look like the kind of drawing that's been partially drawn in pencil. Bear with me. All right, so I'm just going to take my kneaded eraser so I'm not making a huge mess in the house here. And just give it a once over to clean up those construction lines. I don't think I realized I'm being able to see through those, so that joint I should be able to see as a continuation beyond. Okay. So at this stage, I then want to come back. I'm going to use my Papermate. This is the one that has the higher level of line weight to get that profile edge to read well. So again, remember where you have those heavier line weights or those profile edges where you're seeing the edge of something and its returned face is out of view. So you can put your hand around the bottom of that. It's kind of like just doing a survey about what it is that all those lines have in common. When you get to the stair, there's going to be quite a few of these. So the edge of the kind of solid portion of that stair would get this type of line. The stringer itself, top and bottom, would get it, as well as the base of the stair. The bottom of each one of the kind of planks that are suspended off of, or kind of sandwiched, I should say, between the stringer and the millwork, as well as the top. So this is getting quite a bit more line work than most of the other elements because there's so many little pieces within this. But then remember, here you're seeing corners that are change of plane. So that's kind of like the medium line weight. And in this case, the joints would be the smallest, but I want to go back to focusing on just these two line weights for now. So again, here you'll see another trick is when you have very long expanses of line work like this, I use actually my hand on the side of the paper to then just come straight down. So you're really just holding the pen in your hand and using one of your fingers as a guide along the side of the page to create a pretty straight line that you might not normally be able to do so quickly. I think I got all of the profile edges that I would like to capture. As I've gone through this, I start to realize that if I were to do this all in ink, I would have to add a lot of kind of, I don't know a better way to describe it, the noise, the kind of imperfection that concrete gives you here in this cast in place condition. And being able to do a gradient or some very, very subtle change of tone on the base would be very time consuming and difficult to do. So I'm going to change my mind. I'm going to go now to either the black colored pencil or graphite. And I know I said one thing and changed my mind, but as I worked out this, I'm either done here. This is simple line drawing, very, very basic. But in order to describe a little bit more, I want to try to just talk a little bit more about tonality, and how you can combine this as kind of mixed media, although kind of very basic, whether it's just line work like this. Then I want to highlight some of the architectural features that create more of a three-dimensional aspect to this. So I'm going to refer to this, but as you can see, it's really uniformly lit. obviously the back here, this room beyond that I can't see very well is the darkest area. So I'm going to maintain that, but I'm also going to create more depth in this area. So kind of the recesses, I can see that there are lights between the joists up above. The source of the light is hidden, but I'm going to basically turn those lights off in order to make this back space appear darker and thus pushing it back beyond. Then I can create a gradient to kind of spill out into the more open airy space. So if I think about that as being dark, and I'm going to use quite a bit of blending here, the underside of this, I'm again saying those lights are off or they don't exist. The underside of the stair as well. As the light would come back here, it would get darker towards the extreme back edge of this space. And then it would get lighter and lighter and lighter until you kind of come out from beyond that overhang of this millwork piece. So kind of like this, you're seeing, unlike the image that we have in the photo, you don't really see much of a difference in light quality between one edge of this and the other. But in the way that I want to see this, I'm going to make the stance, and just like I do with the exterior architecture, I want to enhance the three-dimensionality of this by adding tone to one side of objects to really give the illusion of form. And it's interesting, in this case, this side appears to be in greater light than this side. I'm going to reverse that actually because I feel that this is the primary face, the kind of face that's more evident, and I'm going to make this the darker face. And that's not the way that the photo was taken, but I'm going to do this just because it's you have to use what is the most, makes your drawing the most believable and three-dimensional. Now the stringer is black, so I am actually, even though that's in light, the stringer I'm going to highlight. So I'm going to show that this materiality, even though I'm only looking at this in graphite, I'm going to see a difference between this material and what looks to be a kind of concrete material here. And I'll get to that a little bit later, but you might have said, Ryan, why are you just got done telling me this is darker and then the face facing the left is lighter. And now I went back and made this dark simply because the photograph is really showing that these are dark elements, the stringer and the handrail. I'm going to focus on that. Okay, so now again, like I did here, this column is very, very important to this composition. I'm going to come across with the side of my pencil. I'm going to layer in. I'm going to keep my pencil sharp because this is going to be, the only way that I can really indicate this as being a cylinder is the way that I treat it with tone. And the top of the column is going to be a little bit darker than the base. And so I'm going to come back and now carry down some of that. And the strange thing again, like we saw here, it's hard to tell what the material is, but for whatever reason, the architect here decided to create a datum here and make that dark. So I've indicated that line, and now I'm going to just darken this up a little bit more than the column above so that you can see that it's still an element that is coming out as a cylinder. A little bit of a highlight in the middle there. The underside, this drawing is going to get really messy, by the way. And you can see what happens if you don't have a blending pencil. You can end up getting quite a bit of tone on your fingers here. Eventually, and I'm kind of going rogue here now with the description of this maybe not the most, I'm kind of leaning more towards art and away from architecture at this point, but that's kind of what sketching is. Eventually, you have to be careful because if you have a tendency to rub your wrist or hand on the paper as you do this, and you're working in a very, very soft graphite like this one that I have, you're going to end up having tone in places that you didn't expect it to have. So you got to be careful with this. Unless, of course, you're working from one side at the top, bottom, across if you're right-handed like I am. So just to be careful with that. And I'm working on a very large piece of paper relative to what I think a lot of you are working with. So the underside of the beams, I'm going to give a treatment to that being a bit darker than the rest of the beam. And again, if the uniform lighting here, you can actually hardly, I mean, you can tell that that's actually brighter than it's the neighboring sides, the vertical face here and the horizontal bottom of the slab here. I do the opposite, and this is just, my methods of doing things. I always give darkness to sides that are facing down. That's just me. You don't have to do that. Like soffit conditions, that kind of thing. So here I know that if I were to put my hand now on this page and start adding more tone to this, I might be in trouble. So I got to make sure that I'm always mindful of what it is that I've already done, being careful. Not to, eventually I'll probably get a bunch of graphite on my hand anyway, but for now I'm trying to keep it clean. Again, a soffit condition here. I think that this is a recess that's horizontal. And this appears to be a different material in the distance, which has an uplight linear element here. So as things go back, like I did down here, I'm going to do something not quite as dark because I feel like there's a little bit more airiness to the space above, but I'm going to just add a little bit of tone back there. And then as I come closer to the left, as if there's a source of light over here, I'm going to lighten that up. The side of the beam, again, it's kind of like an exercise of how to create gradients in different planes, depending on where they are relative to the source of the light. And you could always go back, unlike the floor, look at all of the kind of rawness to that concrete where we don't have that same treatment at the base. So you can almost come back here, and I really want to rotate my page, but for the sake of the video, I can't, is kind of creating those striations as if there was a board former up above that was what was used to create this surface. So it's creating tone, but it's also giving a little bit of texture to that. And actually the same could be said for the forming of the beams themselves. And likewise, you could even do the same here. The millwork panel, there's a grain to that. You could just very, very lightly show the kind of directionality of the grain, which we don't have at the base. These are a kind of solid surface or a Formica panel that is very, very uniform. And like I said before, the ground plane doesn't have very much shadow or reflectivity to it, but I do have just enough to kind of give that impression here at the chair and back towards the back wall. And then I drew this little egg here that because that also gives me an opportunity to kind of create three-dimensionality with it and a shadow that can be cast on the ground from it as well. And so here again, I don't see much. It's almost as if there's a light source that's coming straight, washing all of this out. So the back wall is not receiving shadow. I am going to ignore that and I'm going to say, no, I actually want to show a little bit of shadow beyond. So if I had a source of light from above, as that source of light comes to hit each one of these treads, they will cast a shadow on the back wall. And that light will then become more diffuse as you get further away from the stair. So it's more intense. The shadows are more intense where the wall and the treads come together. And then they kind of disperse as you go away from it. And then eventually you come down to this, which, like I had mentioned before, I'm going to be consistent here, that means the vertical riser is going to be more in shadow than the horizontal plane of the tread. And that too, I'm going to give tone to the base. And that's evident here as well. You can see a little bit more of that shadow underneath. Now, this platform is also a wood floor. So I'm going to just, with my very lightest lines now being graphite, I'm going to show those boards showing the materiality here. Actually, it's hard to see, but it looks like there's a trim piece that runs around the edge here. So it's not like these boards go straight down. There's actually a horizontal banding between this. And then this is going to be a very, very subtle thing, but I want to show a change in the plane. So rather than both of these surfaces being treated the same, I'm going to add a little bit of a shadow line to the base where that comes together. And then just a subtle kind of move here to spread that out. So it's not just a hard line. And again, here, this is again millwork panels. I'm showing just is the lightest line quality here, that verticality, that the way that the orientation of the grain is running in the panel behind. And this looks like a funny kind of incandescent light bulb that's exposed. And this again, I can continue to do this. I'm trying to get through as much of this as I can. Another very dark element here. This is either a metal panel that's painted black or just simply a drywall that's painted black, but it is certainly darker than the other elements in the room. And this side is also the side that I'm going to say is in shadow. And actually this is also a dark element. So this because it's kind of creating this frame, I don't really want to draw too much attention to it. I don't want a very dark element that's then bleeding off the side of the page. So I'm going to leave that white as I currently have it. But this space beyond is quite a bit darker, aside of course, for the fact that there is a window beyond. And actually here, this element is actually casting another shadow. So I'm going to go do another gradient here that becomes darker and darker the closer you get to it. And then I can use my finger to kind of spread that out. Just very, very lightly indicating this millwork. So again, I could come back and start adding some of that directionality to this board former up here, and then the directionality of the beam. The one last thing that I really wanted to kind of give a big impression of what's going on in the space is this becoming darker towards the back. This is primarily in shadow, but again, I want to take this kind of foreground being lighter and then applying a little bit more pressure to the graphite as I go back. You can always come back and add more tone. And again, if you're doing this in a different media, there'll be other tricks, but graphite moves very, very easily, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not. So I'm trying my best to keep a clean drawing by holding my hand off the page as much as possible. If you're using black colored pencil or something else, you can move that as well, but it's not quite as easy as graphite would be. And so the image doesn't show me too much in the foreground as far as reflectivity. It's very matte, but I don't want it to just be a single, like as if I had forgotten about it. So I'm just going to add a little bit of tone here and move that. And then finally, I'm going to just add some tone to this back. This, it looks like a hood for be a range or something that. So the reason that I was adding tone to this side, but not to the others, because this is a very, very big element. This one is relatively small compared to the one on the right. And that will cast just a little bit of a shadow down, and I'm going to make that. So I can keep working on this a little bit, but I think in general, this is a simple way of expressing this interior. So I hope that with this in mind, you've seen now a way of capturing an interior space. All the rules are the same as what we have been discussing when we're looking at the perspective of exterior. It's just that now we have that additional surface to deal with, almost like looking at the sky is really, in this case, a very, like we're inverting it, right? The space here is now focused more on what's happening in the ceiling condition and the bottom, which is relatively flat in this case. Often you will have joints. It's rare. Until I started drawing this, I didn't even think about it. It's so monolithic that it almost appears like the sky. So normally we would be looking at this, there's all the activity happening in the foreground in an image of the exterior. And then the sky is really the space that's just left open and not much happening unless there's clouds, but you don't always want to draw that. So in this case, that's kind of the opposite. So in one trick, like I had mentioned, with this idea of creating that frame, if you want to capture something to show an edge, but then have elements of the architecture bleed beyond that, that's another option. So you can, of course, continuously go back and add things like, some of the imperfections of the concrete or some of this speckle effect of the pock marks in the concrete. So lots of moves that can be made here yet after looking at this. So hopefully this recording has worked, and I'll be able to see some of the things that you have done for this interiors. And we'll talk again on Friday about another interior space, something larger, of a larger scale, but the principles are all the same. So I think with that, I will stop the video, and good luck with this interior drawing. We'll have it posted on Wednesday, and so next week, Wednesday, this will be due, and just check back on Canvas. So thanks everyone for listening, and I will talk to you soon.